I present to you the 42nd President of the United States of America, William Jefferson Clinton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank the wonderful musicians. I hated to stop the music when I came out. Were they great or what? Thank you very much. They played at the White House a few years ago for me, and I'm glad to hear them again. I was sitting there backstage looking at Jim Hunt on the screen and thinking, you know, it's just too bad how he's lost his enthusiasm as he got older. Just has no juice left. Doesn't believe in anything. Amazing. Chancellor Obinger, Mr. Ingram, thank you for what you're doing here. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. I'm honored to be here with many people who've been my friends for a long time, too numerous to mention, but I do want to thank President Bush's Secretary of Health and Human Services, the former Wisconsin Governor, Tommy Thompson, for being here. We've been great friends for 20 years, and I'm delighted to see him. Thank you. And I understand, somebody told me Governor Bredesen from Tennessee is here. Hi, Phil. Thank you for being here. And I want to thank my great former Chief of Staff, Erskine Bowles, his wife, Pandel, for being here. Thank you. That's good. Let's vote again. Thank you. I never worked with a better man or an abler man in public life, and I thank him for everything he did for me. Two of my ambassadors were here, Jeanette Hyde and Mark Irwin, and scores of my other friends. Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to see you here. I'm glad to be here with Jim and Carolyn Hunt and their family. I met Jim Hunt the first time, he may not remember this, in 1978. I was 32, looked about 20. Time sure took care of that. Time in Newt Gingrich, I wish I'd been able to see him today to thank him. But anyway, so I got elected governor, you know, and I didn't have a clue. I thought I did. That's the way young people are. I thought I had all the clues. But they sent us to Georgia, to this beautiful retreat to teach us how to be governors. Everybody got elected in 1978. I went to governor's school. Hillary had the same thing. She got elected to Senate. They sent her to senator school for a day. I don't know how you're supposed to learn it a day, but I made sure, you know, I felt like I was sending Chelsea off to school. I made sure she had a nice dress and got plenty of sleep the night before and all that. So anyway, I went to governor's school and I met Jim Hunt. And I thought, well, I don't know very much, but I know that's the kind of governor I want to be. And we've been friends all this long time. We fought all those education battles in the late 70s and all through the 80s. And he actually, I hate to tell this, given the results of the recent elections, but he actually got me started in national politics. Maybe Jesse can raise some money off of you now. Old Jim, he nominated me for vice chairman of the National Democratic Governors. And it sounded pretty good to me. I didn't know what they did or what I was supposed to do. And then our chairman, Ella Grasso from Connecticut, who was a magnificent woman, got sick and passed away, and kind of resigned several months before she died. And so I had to succeed, and the Democratic governor's guy had to give a speech at the Democratic convention, and they gave me 5 minutes, and I talked 4.5. I thought it was innocuous enough. And it was the year of the Reagan landslide in America, and especially in the South, and they just beat the living daylights out of me for speaking at the Democratic convention. And all of a sudden, in November of 1980, I was the youngest former governor in the history of the United States of America. But I forgave Jim for that. Anyway, it was a cautionary tale. Probably did me a lot of good getting beat, although I still didn't like it very much. And I got reelected in '82, and then President Reagan's Secretary of Education, Terrell Bell, issued that wonderful report, A Nation at Risk, one of the best things ever done, I thought, analyzing the problems of American education at the time. And we all set to work again. And there was a remarkable spirit at that time among the governors, without regard to party. We were just trying to help educate our kids better. A remarkable contrast to some of the extreme bitterness and polarization that has come to mark our national politics. I want to say more about that in a minute, but throughout all this time, Jim Hunt has been kind of my lodestar of what it means to be a good public servant. He and Carolyn have been wonderful friends to Hillary and me. I have, whenever he had a problem as governor, the worst time in our whole relationship was when I was president and he was governor. And if you have ever tried to tell him no about anything, you know what I mean. I mean, I thought, one time one of the kids that worked with me in the White House came and said, you're never going to carry North Carolina. Why do you keep sending money to Jim Hunt? And I said, have you ever tried to tell Jim Hunt no about anything? There's a flood in North Carolina. Cost $100 billion to fix or something. I just want to write a check and say, go away. Come see me when I leave the White House. Not since Noah has there been a thing like this. It was amazing. So, anyway, I just rolled for him the whole time I was there. But it paid off. I got a good introduction tonight. I'm telling you all this to try to put in some perspective what it meant to me to be invited here in 1988, 17 years ago, to speak to the Emerging Issues Forum. Because for people like us, and not all Democrats, Tommy, I know he feels the same way too, we read the newspaper and we see what passes for political debate, and it has like nothing to do with what we do with our lives all day, every day in public life. And sometimes 90% of the voting is done on what you spend less than 1% of your time on. It's just, and when we were here in '88, I thought, this is what democracy is supposed to be all about. You had all these different kind of people here from all over the state of North Carolina seriously talking about the future of this state. I don't think anybody made a partisan remark the whole time I was here. We were just trying to figure out what was good for the kids, what would build you a better future, how we could bring people together, how we could overcome the embedded problems that all the southern states shared and that rural people nearly everywhere shared. So I was delighted to be asked to come back I'm delighted that you've got this Leadership Institute, because I think we need more leaders trained to think like you do. And I want to thank you for one other thing. When I was president, he was head of something called the National Board for Professional Teacher Certification, right? And that was a fancy name for a board that certified so-called master teachers, people who had proved not only that they did well in the classroom, but had received special training, understood the role of curriculum, understood the role of principals, understood the role of creating a special culture in every school to make sure all children can learn. And when we started, when they issued their first report, there weren't any such animals. And he came to me and wanted me to support some funding for it, and I did. And we started out, I think we had 50 or 150 or something, then we had 500, and now you have how many? 25,000. And if you keep going till we have at least one in every school building in America, it will measurably improve the quality of education for all of our children, because they infect the other teachers with their experience and knowledge. The other thing he did was to pass a program here as governor to identify failing schools and require them to be turned around or shut down or put under new management. I think I can say this on behalf of all the governors here present. The most wonderful thing about being governor and the most frustrating thing about being governor is dealing with education. There is not a single problem in American education that hadn't been solved by somebody somewhere. And yet, as an institution, it seems utterly resistant to copying. You know, the Founding Fathers set up the states as the laboratories of democracy. And I used to tell the people who worked for me when I was governor, I was always proud when Arkansas was the first state to do something, but I was more proud when we were the second state to do something, because it showed we were paying attention and not ashamed to learn from other people. And so those of us who've really been dedicated to this over time have really looked for one or two kind of silver bullets that, if we could do everywhere, would raise the promise of excellence in education. Less than a mile from my office in Harlem, there's a public school that's 99% African American. More than half the kids living below the poverty line. 98% of the kids graduate on time from high school. 92% of them go to college, and their test scores are above the New York State average. Not the New York City average, the New York State average. Because they have Frederick Douglass County. And it's a school choice school, but they don't discriminate based on your past grades, your IQ, your income, your nothing. All you got to do is agree to play by the rules. And they've created a culture there in which every one of those children is absolutely convinced that he or she can go to Mars if they want to, can become president if they want to, can do whatever they want to do if they're prepared to work. So I think this thing you did when I was president caused me to get some money from Congress, and we funded several hundred schools in other states to do what North Carolina was requiring on a statewide basis, because in his last go-around as governor, North Carolina had the best improvement in overall student performance scores of any state in the United States of America. So I thank you for that. Now, I made a big mistake yesterday, so you're going to have to wait a little longer to eat, because I called Jim and I said, I made a terrible mistake. I said, Jim, what do you want me to talk about tomorrow night? And I got an answer. And he said he wanted me to say a few words about health care and then try to put it in the larger context of where we are as a country and where we ought to be going. So I'm going to try to do both as briefly as I can. As president, I worked hard on health care, partly because I'd been governor of a state with a lot of rural places that had no access to health care, with a lot of working poor people and small business people that had no access to health care coverage, with the state university hospital that was always threatened with going broke because we dealt with all the people that had no coverage. So I saw the problems in finance, access, and coverage. And we'd made some significant progress, but we never caught up. I just want to say this about Governor Bredesen, he's got a terrible headache now because Tennessee tried to get ahead of the whole United States in covering working people and their children who had no insurance. But he found that without help from the federal government and with unbridled inflation and health care costs, it became an unsustainable burden for him. So now he's got to make decisions that will doubtless be unpopular with some people, but people just got to understand that this is not a problem any state is rich enough to solve alone. We have to do this together. So anyway, in '94 I proposed this health care plan, which basically said everybody ought to buy health insurance. Employers and employees and individuals if they were self-employed or unemployed, and those who couldn't afford it, including small businesses, would be subsidized. Erskine was then head of the Small Business Administration and helped me sell the plan in part because small businesses were getting killed out there if they did the right thing and they insured their employees. They were paying much higher premiums than big businesses. They couldn't get in big pools. So if they had one sick person in the pool with a few hundred people or a couple of thousand people in the pool, it could skyrocket everybody else's premiums. So we tried to deal with that. When we announced it, all the experts said it was a perfectly moderate plan. By the time the health insurance companies got through spending $300 million to perform reverse plastic surgery on it, it was some radical government takeover of the healthcare system. A classic illustration of one of the rules of politics, which is that the victors get to write history whether it's true or not. Now, they said, you know, if Clinton's health care plan passes, that people would lose their health insurance coverage, bureaucrats would make health care decisions, and people would be denied needed health care. Well, my plan didn't pass, but now we have more people without health insurance companies, more bureaucrats making health care decisions, more people being denied needed health care. So what we did was to spend the next 6 years trying to chip away at this. And I want to be perfectly honest about what we achieved and what we couldn't achieve. We did, as Jim said, pass the Children's Health Insurance Program. It's insured, Secretary Thompson would know better than me, but something over 5 million children who would not have had health insurance before, and it was the biggest expansion of children's health care since Medicaid. We extended the life of the Medicare Trust Fund to 2030. It was supposed to go broke in 1999. We passed the Kennedy-Kassebaum bill, which said you could change jobs without losing your health insurance, and if somebody in your family was sick, you didn't lose the family coverage. We allowed people with disabilities to go into the workplace and work and still receive government health care because it was much cheaper. We had people with disabilities perfectly capable of working who were costing the government more money because they couldn't go into the workplace, because if they did, they'd lose their Medicaid coverage. We increased spending on HIV and AIDS by 400%, covered 85 million people under federal health plans with a Patient's Bill of Rights, so we made sure that managed care wouldn't deny them needed health care. Made new strides in dealing with breast cancer and prostate cancer. Developed a self-treatment plan for diabetes that the American Diabetes Association said was the most important advance in the care of diabetes since the development of insulin. We got 90% of our kids immunized for the first time, and we had a 20% drop in infant mortality. There were lots of other things that we did to try to help young, single, pregnant women bring their children into the world and not suffer economically because of it, including changing the welfare rules so they could stay home and have their parents help raise the kids and go to school and not lose their government benefits. We had anti-smoking initiatives, anti-teen pregnancy initiatives, worked on bringing violence among young people down. All these things affected the health environment. We had cleaner air, cleaner water, and safer food. That affected the health environment. I'll say more about that in a minute. And when we finished, life expectancy had gone from 75.5 years to 77 years in an 8-year span. That's pretty good. We had record low teen pregnancies. We had, as I said, 90% of our kids immunized for the first time. We had a 70% drop in the AIDS death rate. We had a 22 to 25% reduction in the number of abortions in America without any kind of sort of political controversy that normally swirls around it in an election, just by doing things that help people care for their children and make a living or be educated at the same time, with a serious, disciplined approach. And we had the first reduction in the number of people without health insurance since 1987. That's the good news. But what happened? The economy turned down. We maximized the savings that were available from managed care. Nothing was done about the system of health care finance. The old problems returned, accompanied by some new ones. Now the number of uninsured in America are up to 43%. When I became president, we were spending 14% of our income on health care. We're about up to 15 now. We're supposed to be at 18.3 by the year 2013. The next high, that's for your example, for your information, 14.9% of our economy is $1.6 trillion a year we spend on health care. Next nearest countries are Switzerland and Canada. They're at about 10%. If we were at 10%, that's $500 billion. That's still real money to most people. So it's worth thinking about. But I just want to point out a few things so you know I'm serious when I say you can't take any option off the table. You have to think about this in all of its mind-numbing complexity. In the 20th century, life expectancy went from 47 years to 77 years. But only 8 of those years can be directly attributed to traditional health care, to the development of new medicine, to better medical technology and diagnostic techniques, to the spread of doctors and nurses in hospitals. About 22 of those years came from cleaner water, cleaner air, safer food, better sanitation facilities, and dead mosquitoes. You know, I'm old enough to remember when people still really got sick from that. So now, on the verge of the 21st century, I think you can look forward to new miracles. The young women in this audience who are still of childbearing years, the babies you're about to have, and I saw several who were carrying their babies tonight, the babies you're about to have will probably have life expectancies in excess of 90 years. That's the good news, and it's something to be proud of. With the sequencing of the human genome, it will now be possible when mothers bring their babies home from the hospital to bring those kids home with a gene card that will show you, for example, whether your newborn baby girl has the genetic variances that make her at greater risk for breast cancer, so that she will be able to be tested from 35 on and probably will never have to have a mastectomy. New diagnostic techniques are being developed every day which will stop people from getting in the fix I was. 10% of the people who have heart attacks in America pass all their stress tests because they're otherwise in good shape. And doctors understandably don't want to have invasive angiograms. But we're soon going to be able to see the same thing without being invasive. That can save literally hundreds, maybe thousands of lives every year. So there's a lot to be hopeful about. An area that I care a lot about because it affected a man who became a friend of mine in his later years after he got hurt, Christopher Reeve. Spinal cord injuries. Encouraging. At the end of our time in Washington, medical researchers took nerves out of the legs of laboratory animals and transplanted them in the spines of these animals whose spines had been broken. And they got movement in their lower limbs again. So a lot of great things are going to happen. But we have to look at the challenges as well. And what are they? Let me just mention a few. One, the possibility of genetic discrimination. And especially in the way we insure people now. Right now, there are 6 in 10 women at high risk of breast or ovarian cancer who don't do the test to find out if they are, because if they find out they are, they know they'll be dropped from health insurance policy. And if you were running a health insurance company, particularly if it wasn't a big one, or the woman wasn't in a big pool, you might do the same thing because you were afraid you'd lose all your money if you didn't. But no other country in the world finances health care the way we do, in this crazy quilt pattern. And the bottom line is a lot of women who could live won't, because they won't do the testing in advance. The global economy is going to have a very adverse effect on our health care coverage unless we find a different way to handle it. I was fortunate when I was president. We worked really hard on it. Manufacturing jobs went up in America, and they're going down again. Every American-made car you buy has $1,300 worth of health care in it. That's a lot of money. And it's more than the money that's in a Japanese car or a European car. The aging of the population is going to change things. In 2050, 20% of the population will be over 65. Already, the fastest growing group of people in percentage terms is over 80. Unless we become much, much more active mentally and physically, we're going to have a long-term care problem that would choke a horse. Already, I bet everybody in this room knows somebody, some family, that has been burdened with long-term care. We have to change all our expectations about aging. I was at the Super Bowl yesterday with a guy who's 70 years old. At halftime, I don't know if y'all waited, Paul McCartney was singing. So this guy said to me, he said, "How old is Paul McCartney?" I said, "He's 65. He said, "God, I love that." He said, "I love that." He said, "Think about it, some guy nearly as old as me down there singing those rock and roll songs. Those kids have." But I'm just telling you, we can't all be Paul McCartney, but that's what we all ought to be doing. There was an article 2 years ago in the Journal of the American Medical Association that said that people over 50 who do one set of math problems or one crossword puzzle a day cut their risk of Alzheimer's in half. And I'll say more about that in a minute, but we've got to, the aging of America is going to really change things. And it doesn't do any good to talk about the finance and the health care, the doctors, everything else, if you've got a whole bunch of old people who could be working and going and doing and thinking, and we're all just sitting around waiting for somebody to bring us a napkin. It's not going to work. And I don't mean that now. I don't mean that in a pejorative way. We have to care for people whose bodies wear out. We have to care for people whose minds wear out. But we got to make up our mind that the percentage of us who wear out is going to be smaller than it ever has been in history, because there's just going to be too many of us, and we cannot put that burden on our children and our grandchildren. I had a friend who was in the legislature when I was governor. His daddy was digging post holes and laying fence posts for his farm till he was 97 years old. And then he lived to be 99. And they cared for him for 2 years. But had he been of a different disposition, they might have had to care for him for 20 years, imposing a whole different set of costs, not only on a family, but on a society. And we have to think about that. I'll give you a couple of other examples. That poverty has increased 14% since 2001. The more poor people there are, the more uninsured people there are, the more burden it is on the government, the bigger the deficit is. You cannot have a healthy population with poverty going up. Poverty's got to be going down. I don't care how rich America is. I don't care how much our GDP is. I don't care if the stock market goes to 15,000. If we keep getting those of us who are wealthy get wealthier, but people who are poor get poorer, it's going to wreak havoc with the health care system. Childhood obesity is at an all-time high. At a time when we glorify professional athletics, and we're also seeing to it, probably more than half the schools in America don't have physical education anymore. And 43% of the American food dollar is spent eating out now. Over half of that 43% is spent eating out at fast food places. We need a lobby to change the fat content of the food. You can't change people's habits. You've got too many mothers and fathers working, and too many people that's the most economical way to eat, and we shouldn't want to put any of these people out of business. We ought to challenge them, however, to change the fat content of the food they're getting, because when they started as fast food places, it was a treat. It was something somebody did once or twice a week. Now it's something a lot of families do once or twice a day. So we have to have a whole strategy about that. because our living patterns have changed. Price of pharmacies, the drugs have gone up 40% in the last 4 years. There's no easy answer for that because we get a lot out of our pharmaceutical industry in America. They have to spend vast amounts of money to develop new drugs. A lot of the money is wasted because it doesn't produce anything. That's what research and development's about. Then when they develop a drug, they got to recover their advertising costs and advertising and marketing costs plus their embedded research costs. But we have to find a way to reconcile the legitimate financial interest of those companies with the legitimate quality of generic drugs that can be produced to figure out a way to not have 40% inflation over every 4 years. Otherwise, we'll all be broke. I don't care how we change the financing of medical care, because we should want more people to take medicine, because medicine saves money over the long run. It keeps people out of the hospital. It maintains their quality of life. It keeps them healthy so they can work. It keeps their minds alert. And there's not an easy answer to this, but we can't have that level of inflation because we're going to have more medicine. You'd be amazed at the stuff I have to take every day now that I got this cut open chest of mine. And you know, I can afford it, but I just kept thinking, what about all the people like me who don't have the health insurance I have, don't make the kind of money I make? And they need this medicine bad as I do, and we need them in our society. So we have to think about that. Now, final thing I want to say is about $1 in $4 in the American healthcare system, or about $400 billion a year, is spent on administrative costs. That's a staggering figure, and it's because of the way we finance healthcare. Because you got this crazy quilt pattern of various health insurance policies, and then they have spent a lot of money deciding, can you have this procedure or not on your policy? And you got all these nice young people working for these companies. They know they're never going to get in trouble if they say no. So you got to have an appeal. And so the overall administrative costs, at least when I was working on this several years ago, was somewhere between 8 and 13 cents on the dollar within the insurance community. But when you get out, every doctor's got to have more people handling the paper. Every hospital's got to have more people having the paper. Everybody's got to do it. There's got to be some way that we can reduce this. Just within the health insurance sector alone, the difference in the administrative cost of a big program that insures everybody, like Medicare or Medicaid, and people with private health insurance, is something on the order of $140 billion a year. To give you some idea, it costs $35 billion to hospitals and medical centers and doctors to treat people without insurance. And their lost time at work and lost productivity because of that's twice that, so about $105 billion a year. So what should we do about it? Well, first of all, Newt Gingrich, I think, has already talked, but one thing that he and Hillary have both worked on is the idea of modernizing the whole record-keeping system with information technology. It is truly appalling. How many times have you ever been to an emergency room where they made you give you all those facts all over again? Or you go to a new doctor, you got to go through all your personal history again. I can't even remember my name anymore, much less when I had measles. And most people's medical records are still owned by doctors and hospitals. So basically what Hillary's got a bill on this, basically what Newt's advocating is that everybody ought to have a personal medical record, and you ought to have ownership of it, but it ought to be computerized, and you ought to be able to approve access to it, so that we could save huge amounts of money simply by computerizing information. It would also help to cut the time between the development of a new medical discovery and its regular implementation in medical practice throughout America. Believe it or not, there's still a time lag of several years between when a new technology is developed or new procedures developed and its regular implementation in the medical system. That's a management issue. It's not a health care issue, and it's not a political issue. So I think there's a lot to be done on that. Second thing I want to say is, don't forget what I told you about how we improve life expectancy. Public health is very important. In New York City, our health problems are very high where my office is in Harlem, partly because we have one of the highest asthma rates among children in America. And there are reasons for that, why the air is dirtier there than it is in Raleigh, for example. And when our health care bill goes up, you can't blame the health insurance companies, the drug companies, the doctors, the trial lawyers. You can't blame anybody, because it's going to keep going up unless we clean the air. In Washington, there's an uncommon amount of lead in the water, which poses particular risk in the nation's capital to our children. So we have to see these whole environmental issues as healthcare issues. The third thing I'd like to say is I think that we do have to cut the number of uninsured. And since it was clear from the whipping I took that we'll never get a law passed that requires everybody to buy insurance if it is an employer-employee system, with the result that employees who do buy insurance, who are small businesses, feel punished every year, so they just quit buying it. And even big companies feel punished, so they stop insuring their retirees, which is a huge problem in America because so many people retire at 55. When I started this work on healthcare in '93, 46% of the Fortune 500 companies had adequate health policies for retirees. Today, 29% do. So you can say you don't want to fool with this, but it's just going to get worse. And then they come to Phil Bredesen and they say, I'm 56 years old and my wife just got cancer and there's just 2 of us working and we are supporting 3 grandchildren. What are we supposed to do? So if I could make some suggestions that are less onerous but do cost money, you could let all the early retirees between 55 and 65 buy into the Medicare program in proportion to their ability to pay. I tried to pass that for 2 years in Congress and couldn't, but it's an easy thing to do. Hillary's got a bill to expand the number of people who are eligible to be in the children's health insurance programs. You could have all the people who are in that program, their parents could be eligible to buy in proportion to their ability to pay, so they could get health insurance too. It would cost more, but it'd be a lot cheaper than the system we've got. And finally, the last group of people you have without insurance largely are young single people or self-employed people, and I have thought for years they should be allowed to buy into the federal health insurance program that federal employees buy into, because we get like 24 choices, including if you're young and single and you think you're going to live forever, you take a catastrophic policy, and at least, you know, if you have a terrible accident, you don't impose an enormous burden on society or bankrupt your family. And that could be done at relatively low cost, and the administrative cost of all these programs is quite low. We insure about 2 million people in the federal employees plan right now. So you got a huge pool. Now, there are some people who believe that we should just have a tax subsidy system and let individuals buy their insurance and get businesses out of it because you can't make it fair the way it is. The only problem with that is you will still have, if you leave the system the way it is, you have huge segmenting of the market, because if you've got diabetes, so you've got a kid with diabetes, or you've had cancer that even though you've been declared cancer-free, you're still going to be uninsurable unless somebody has a huge pool so that your illness does not bankrupt them. I'll never forget back in '93, I met a young couple where they were both working, and only one of them worked for a place that provided health insurance. It was a nonprofit, and there were only 20 employees. And they had a very desperately sick child. And because they were in a small pool, a small business, they were told that they were going to raise the premium of every employee in this nonprofit $50 a month unless they fired this person. made her unemployed, and then maybe, presumably, made their children eligible for government health care. So we've got to find a way to share the risks and to lower the administrative costs in the financing system. No other country in the world finances health care the way we do, which is why almost every other country with any money covers 100% of the people at a much lower cost. I don't mind paying some more costs because we've got a great pharmaceutical industry, we've got the best medical technology in the world, and we keep people alive just as long as we can, and I like that. A lot of people don't. I do. You know, I think that we got an obligation to let, well, you're laughing, but they don't. A lot of countries don't do that. And maybe we take it too far sometime, but, you know, I had a father-in-law who lingered on a week longer than maybe he should have after a massive stroke. And maybe, you know, we should have just taken somebody's word for it that he'd never come back to life. But I like the fact that we didn't, and that we let God take him in his own good time. So if we want to do all these things, we'll have to pay a little more. But we can't keep paying 5% more of our income, our national income, or that's 1/3 of $1.6 trillion, that is $500 billion, and still not covering everybody and losing ground every year, and making no preparation for the aging of the population. The last thing I want to say is I think we ought to spend a lot more on prevention. It'd be the cheapest thing we could ever do. I think, now, let me just, some of you may have seen the governor of my home state, who happens to be a Republican and a friend of mine, on television. He lost over 100 pounds. And he started a program where women in my state, in Arkansas, could bring their newborns in and their young children in, and they'd measure the body fat of the parents and the children and give people, many of them without any education at all, a plan for how they could eat sensibly to maintain the health of their children. And you might say, well, nobody will go see that. They were flooded with people. It, you know, was insulting to poor people to say they didn't want to do a good job raising their kids. They were flooded with people. And, you know, the governor, because he got a nice new skinny body, was like the poster boy of the thing. But it's a really good thing to do. I think most of these fast food places would be glad to change comprehensively the content of what they're serving, as long as they knew everybody was on board. And there wasn't going to be some sneak attack advertising campaign trying to undermine their market position because they tried to do the right thing. So there are lots of things we can do in that area, and somehow we've got to get exercise back into the school regimen again, because there are too many kids that live in networks. There's neighborhoods. I want to say this because I live in one. There are too many kids that live in neighborhoods that don't have sidewalks anymore, where they got to ride everywhere they go. So, in sum, we need to use information technology more. We need to emphasize public health. We need to expand coverage and cut the number of uninsured. We need to emphasize prevention. And we're going to have to do it together. If we have a big food fight like we did in 93, we'll get 94, we'll get the same result we got then. But we are on course to have human misery that is unacceptable in a country as wealthy as ours, where people like most of us in this audience will always do great. I had the best health care in the world. I never blinked. I wasn't scared 5 minutes. Once they found, I was just so relieved I didn't have a heart attack and died. I didn't know what to do. Because I knew where I was going. I knew who was going to take care of me. I knew they would get paid. I never had to give it a second thought. And if everybody in America knew that, we'd be better off. And so, now, you know, that brings me, I think the title of this whole event is My Healthcare is Your Problem or something. I mean, I identified with that when I had that heart attack. That heart problem, I thought it was everybody's problem. Everybody seemed to know about it. But I believe that is true in a deeply philosophical sense. And that brings me to the last part of what I wish to say to you. Whether you're talking about North Carolina State University, the community of Raleigh, the state of North Carolina, the United States, or increasingly the whole world, if you had to describe the 21st century in only one word, most people who've been in business would say globalization, but the proper word, which encompasses that, is interdependence. Interdependence simply means you can't escape each other, and whatever we do affects people beyond our normal circle, for good or ill. I mean, 9/11 was the world's worst example of interdependence, right? These guys, these killers, used our open borders, our easy transportation, our easy access, our easy immigration law, easy access to information and technology. You can get on the internet and learn how to make a bomb of any kind, to kill 3,000 people from 70 countries in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. Interdependence. In the recent intifada in the Middle East, which broke my heart, where 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis were killed, average age of the Palestinians 18, average age of the Israelis 24. After 7 years of progress toward peace, in 1998, when not a single Israeli died from a terrorist act, in all that time, all the time they were killing each other, they weren't a bit less interdependent than they were the year when nobody died. It's just that the positive interdependence turned to negative interdependence. That's the only difference, but they couldn't get away from one another, so they just kept on killing each other. Now, my whole worldview is shaped by this. I think the great challenge for the United States, within our borders and in the world in the 21st century, is how to elevate the forces of positive interdependence and beat down the forces of negative interdependence. How to build a community of shared benefits, shared responsibilities, and simple shared values. And I mean simple. Everybody counts, everybody deserves a chance. We all do better when we work together. Our differences are important, but our common humanity matters more. That's what I believe. Now, therefore, whether you're talking about health care at home or the work that I do around the world on AIDS, where I'm trying to keep kids alive I'll never meet, work you do in your local community, if it is something that promotes shared benefits, shared responsibilities, and shared values, it's good. If it undermines them, it's bad. So I think our agenda, of which healthcare should be a part, should include, in the larger world, should we have a security agenda to break all the terrorists we can and restrict the access to weapons of mass destruction and the materials that make them? You bet we should. If you live in an interdependent world, can you kill, jail, or occupy all your actual or potential enemies? No. You can't get that done. So if you can't, you got to build a world with more partners and fewer enemies all the time you're fighting your enemies. And to do that, you have to have a strategy, which I think should include putting 130 million kids in school in the world that never go to a schoolhouse at all. We're sitting here worried about how to make our schools work. There's 130 million children in this world that never darken the door of any schoolhouse. And countless others that don't have any educational material. In Africa, the poorest continent on earth, most poor countries are so poor that they still have to charge the parents for their kids' schooling. President of Kenya, the new president of Kenya, just got elected, and he dropped the school fees. Overnight, 1 million kids showed up. 1 million in one country. You want to know one of the reasons that we had so much trouble with people in Pakistan sympathizing with the Taliban and with Al-Qaeda and Mr. bin Laden is that Pakistan was so poor they were charging people to send their kids to school, whether they could afford it or not. So the fundamentalists set up all these religious schools and let people come for free. So poor people sent their kids there. They were building the forces of negative interdependence. So I think that's what you have to think. But one of the most heartening things to me that's happened lately is that 1/3 of all American households gave money to the work that we did collectively against the tsunami. 1/3. And over half of them gave over the internet. The average contribution was $279. That includes all the $1 million contributions. The median contribution, the one in the middle, was under $100. So people get this, you know, if they're given a chance. And that's the last thing I want to say. If we want to do good around the world, we have to keep getting better at home. And I told Jim, I've tried to, all my life, I've tried to have a debate where we could have our political differences and still be friends or respectful. I don't think every opponent I ever had was my enemy. And I don't like those who do. But we have to ask ourselves some pretty hard questions here. I mean, is it a good thing, given the fact that we've got this huge deficit, 45% of which is caused by the tax cuts, half of which went to people in the top 1%, that I got 2 tax cuts while we're at war in Iraq, paid for by the Social Security taxes middle-class people pay, and borrowed money from China and India. I mean, China and Japan and Saudi Arabia, because we have to go borrow money every day to cover our deficit. And that's how my tax cuts paid for. Is that really good for us? And that some kid's going to have to pay off the tax cut that I got someday? I just got back from the Bahamas, where we quadrupled the number of people my foundation did getting AIDS medicine in the last 2 years. And I met these 3 kids that I was with 2 years ago when we started this that were on death's door. These 2 beautiful little twin girls, 6 years old. And they looked like a bag of bones 2 years ago, and they're beautiful and healthy now. I met a boy who was 15 years old, who was just barely above 4 feet tall. His body had been so eaten up by AIDS. He didn't do anything wrong. And now he's 17 and he's up to my shoulder and his body is strong. And that's about all I care about. And you think about it, that's what we all ought to care about. We shouldn't live in a country where whether your kid grows up healthy or not depends upon whether you got a middle-class income and a big company that's got health insurance. We shouldn't live in a world. And I believe there's a huge amount of bipartisan support for this. Now, I'll guarantee you the Republicans and Democrats are pretty evenly divided on all those internet contributions for tsunami relief. President Bush and I have had a great time doing this. People come up to me all the time and thank me that we're doing it. And I said, well, I've liked this guy for 20 years. Just because I disagreed with him doesn't mean that we're not friends and we don't believe in doing things together. And when the UN asked me to work on this long-term tsunami relief, I said, well, you'll have to ask the president. I'm not about to do anything in the international arena that my president doesn't want me to do, even though he's a person of another party. And he said, okay. When I dedicated my library, I said, you know, I got to thinking the last 3 or 4 days of this election, I was the only person left in America that liked both John Kerry and George W. Bush. And this is the last point I want to leave with you. You think about that. You don't think about anything else, think about that. When we did the debt relief in 2000 for the poorest countries, Pat Robertson came to the White House for the first time, after spending a lifetime jumping up and down on me. Why? Because it reflected our shared values. The president, thanks to Tommy Thompson in no small measure, have made an unprecedented commitment to fight AIDS, something I care a great deal about. We got 6 million people at death's door, folks, and only about 400,000 of them getting medicine. 100,000 more than when we started a couple of years ago, but we got a long way to go. And I don't think there's a partisan element to that. I said what I did about abortion earlier. I think we can just wait for every election and just cut each other's guts out over that, or we can get together and do what we did for 8 years when I was there. We took the number of abortions down by 22 to 25% without all this political back and forth, because we recognized it was a difficult, painful, moral question, and we wanted to give choices to people to make the right decisions. So, what's the problem? We've been around on this planet about 100,000 years. That'll get me in trouble with some people, but we have. Ever since the first person stood up on the African savannah. And then people began to live in clans and caves. And then they began to get in contact with other people who were different from them. And ever since that first contact happened, from different families and different clans, people have felt the to and fro of wanting to hurt the other and separate themselves from the other and look down on the other and find some way to figure out this person is just like me. And all of human history can be seen as a widening circle of interdependence. And at every time we come up against it, we have a crisis. Now we're worried about fundamentalism and terrorism. And it's frightening, but remember World War II, folks. Remember what happened in World War II. Remember what happened when the Russians slaughtered people by the millions who weren't good communists. Remember what happened in China when it happened. All the millions of people, the tens of millions of people who died in World War II, the Jews in the Holocaust, and all the others, because they were the other. Because people couldn't imagine positive interdependence. And it puts the current fight we're in with the terrorists and the fundamentalists in some context. All you got to believe, like if you're a good old North Carolina Bible thumper raised like I was in the Baptist church, to get to where we want to go, is that St. Paul was right when he compared life here with life in heaven after death. He said, now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now we know in part. All you got to do is admit the possibility that you might be wrong once in a while, and the other person might be right, and you'll just be amazed. We'll solve health care and education and build the most interesting world that anyone has ever known. Thank you very much, and God bless you.